This stained glass window that we're looking at together now is really a very special aesthetic treasure for Trinity Methodist Church, one of the really distinctive features of our congregation. Some say that when the church was built, this was the largest stained glass window in the southern hemisphere. But what I'd really like us to just focus on for a moment is the story that it tells. We have what we're looking at the moment is the story of Jesus' birth, where it all started for the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Over to the right, we see a scene which is really a composite scene. It's essentially the scene of the transfiguration of Jesus, and where the disciples were able to see him for who he really is, Lord of all. But the posture he has is very much the posture of the crucifix, and so it's really also telling us of him giving his life for us. To the right of that is the vine, which is prefiguring the church, but also telling of Israel, out of which the Christian movement would be born. A very long story being told just in that vine. And then as we move to the top of the stained glass window, we see the dove, which is the symbol of the Spirit of Jesus that is poured out on Pentecost and given to all believers, the Spirit that forms the church so that we can continue the work of Jesus. So in this stained glass window, we have the whole story being told of Jesus' ministry, what went before it and what comes after it. We who are preachers here at Trinity have the enormous privilege each week to stand below this window, and every week we touch on some aspect of the story of Jesus and what that means for us today. It's very interesting, in this stained glass window there are stones below and the bottom part of the stained glass window, and that really speaks of the living stones that we are called to be. God's involvement in the world, in Jesus, is told in the story of this window. The important thing to realize is that God's involvement always tells a story. History is really God's story in this world. And we are invited to be involved with that story. Now, there's one aspect that's important for us here at Trinity Methodist Church that we don't talk about every Sunday, a part of the story that we don't talk about every Sunday, and that's the story of the birth of the Methodist movement in the ministry of John Wesley. And I'd like for us to focus on that story now. Perhaps just firstly to acknowledge that we would obviously wish for a Christian world in which there are not different denominations and different churches. But the reality is that there are different denominations, and we belong to one of those denominations. It is interesting that throughout the history of the church, the Spirit of Jesus has used different leaders to help us to follow Jesus more closely. And in fact, that happened right in the early church. Paul, Peter, James were three different leaders of the early church, and there were differences between the way in which they led and the way in which their followers followed Jesus. But let's think now about the story of John Wesley in 18th century England, and what started then became the Methodist movement. So John Wesley was born in 1703, 17th of June in England.
the 15th of 19 children. Can you believe it? But the important thing, I think, just for us to appreciate is what was England like in the 18th century, in those 1700s, early 1700s. England was in fact in a terrible state. Corruption was rife. The exploitation of all sorts of poor, marginalized people was a tremendous problem in society. Wellness of the people was very, very, very poor. Literacy rates were very low. There were conditions in prisons were terrible. There were awful injustices like the execution of people for petty offenses, loose living, drunkenness, brutality. The poor had very little job opportunities, and so unemployment was very, very high. And this was the condition of England. It's important to mention these conditions because the story of John Wesley and his ministry would end up changing many of these conditions. In fact, England would be changed in those 1700s through John Wesley's revival movement and the birth of the Methodist Church.